From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, notable also in this debate over the NDAA was a bit of the argument within the Republican Party on the question of further funding and aid for Ukraine. There was an amendment that was offered which failed pretty swiftly and soundly. How much do you read into where that says the GOP is going on that question?
We actually had two amendments that failed that I think really spoke loudly. One of them was an amendment by Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene. This particular bill has about $300 million in it for a training program for Ukraine forces. She attempted to get rid of that. It failed 341 to 89. Another Republican, Matt Gaetz of Florida, he wanted to try to block future security assistance to Ukraine. That failed 358 to 70. And what we have here is a kind of loud and vocal minority is what we're learning. Minority within the Republican Party and some within the Democratic Party too. Those who are a little bit more isolationist and believe that it's wrong that the Biden administration is involved in any foreign efforts like what's going on in Ukraine. And that coalition gets a lot of headlines and they pop off a lot in the news. And they've gotten some more attention given that Donald Trump, now running for the president, seems to be more and more in that camp. But what we see with these two votes is that there is a broad and enduring coalition of Republicans and Democrats. And I stress the Republican side of that because this is where you've seen some of the bleed there and some of these populists who want to say that America shouldn't have a strong presence in the world, should just hole up and focus on American priorities. But we have a very enduring coalition that remains very strong in this effort to help Ukraine win against Russian aggression. And that was a nice thing to see come out of a bill that otherwise had been fairly contentious.
Let's also talk about the question of this Pentagon abortion policy. And Kate, this is a matter that Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville made a point of raising, blocking Pentagon nominees. Can you explain what he's been doing and whether that seems to be an effective way of getting the Pentagon's attention?
Yeah, so Kim described the policy that the Pentagon developed in the wake of the court's Dobbs decisions. The Pentagon reinterpreted one of its policies to allow travel expenses and leave for those who travel to another state to receive an abortion. And now the Pentagon will say, well, we're not underwriting the actual abortion, just the plane ticket to get there, which is still, to Kim's point, not consistent with federal statutes that try to distance the military and government programs in general from financing or facilitating abortion. So that is what the Pentagon decided to do. It deliberately waded into this political fight that the country has been having about abortion. And then what happened is that the Alabama senator took issue with that, and he has decided to hold up hundreds of military promotions. Now, I don't think this is a winning tactic for a few reasons. I've been describing it as bringing a nuclear weapon to a knife fight. It is a scorched earth tactic to put a blanket hold on promotions this way. It also, you'll note I said promotions. This basically means that some of the people getting held up are, for instance, say you're a Navy captain trying to put on your first star to be a rear admiral. That's held up. You can't move to your next post. You can't enroll your high schoolers in a new school. So some of the people who are affected by the hold are not the people who drive the Pentagon's abortion policy and can't do anything about it. So it's not really extracting enough of a price on the people who made the policy. And what we've seen so far, keep in mind, I mean, the Pentagon could drop the policy and move the nominations, but they've declined to do that because they found a political winner and because they think, as we were talking about with the House bill, I mean, elective abortion is apparently more important than all the other important work that the military does if this is the hill they're going to die on. So I don't think it's a good tactic. I think Tuberville should find a way out of it and accept an amendment vote. He's made his point and let some of these promotions go forward. The vacancies are piling up and they include posts like the Commandant of the Marine Corps. I don't think this is a winner for Republicans, especially holding up promotions for career officers. But I do think it's very clear here that the Pentagon's the aggressor and has decided to go write a policy that facilitates abortion, which is not legal and which violates the conscience of a lot of Americans.
Yeah, it might not be a winner for Republicans. And General C.Q. Brown, who has been nominated to run the Joint Chiefs, is saying that he's worried the military might lose talent if these promotions are continued to be held up. On the other hand, Kim, is this really a winner for Democrats? It seems like whatever people's feelings about the legality of abortion, there's a pretty strong consensus against having public funding for it. And does this distinction that the Pentagon is trying to make between we're not really funding the service, we're only paying for the travel for our service members to get to the location. I mean, I think that's a pretty fine distinction for them to make if they think they're going to get public support for that.
Yeah, polls have always shown a very different landing spot for Americans on the question of taxpayer funding of abortion. You know, we have a pretty strong consensus in the country that people want abortion to be legal, but it's very different in most people's minds when it comes to the question of whether or not people's hard-earned tax dollars, which they send to Washington for the purpose of standing up, for instance, the military, end up getting used on provisions like abortion that are deeply offensive to a certain category of the country and a deeply moral question as well, too, for those particular voters. So polls usually show that about 60% of agree with the notion that you shouldn't have taxpayer funding of abortion. Some polls show even higher numbers than that. And so I agree with you, Kyle, that I don't necessarily think this is a great landing spot for Democrats, especially because most people can understand that there is no real distinction between travel and the service itself. I mean, if you are facilitating it, you are facilitating it, and taxpayer dollars are being used for that. I think the same goes for some of the other provisions that they are now willing, again, and I find it quite extraordinary, willing to vote against the National Defense Authorization Bill, which has this pay raise for service members and vital dollars for military upgrades, that they're willing to do that on the basis of these issues like, for instance, gender transition, which is extremely controversial and not necessarily sweepingly approved of in the country, or diversity. A lot of Americans want to see our military succeed, and they want to see them not wrapped up in these climate initiatives and diversity fights and abortion fights. Like, they have a mission, let them do their mission without weighing it down. So I don't necessarily think this is great for Democrats. And one of the evidence of that was the fact that you did have those 4 Democrats, all of them in swing districts in places where they fear for their reelection next year, coming and voting for this bill in the House, even though it's supposedly, according to other Democrats, absolutely reprehensible. But they understand this is where their voters are.
Okay, we'll give you the last word for now, but is this a bill where you expect some quiet compromise between the House and the Senate? Nobody wants this NDAA bill to be held up for a long time, or do you expect some sparks to fly when we get to a confrontation between the version that the House passed and whatever the Senate is going to now do?
Yeah, just to round out our last discussion, I would just add to, I think it's important for listeners to know that women service members have been serving abroad in the military for decades in places like South Korea or Germany and places that have more restrictive abortion policies than the United States does. So this idea also that this Pentagon policy is needed, I think is misguided. And it really was just a choice on the Biden administration's part to go after this cause and to use the military in this kind of blatantly partisan way. So I think that is just unfortunate. Now, on the negotiation, I think the relevant question is whether some of the House members who insisted on some of these amendments are willing to compromise in the end, as they will have to. I think they will need to pick some of them. They will need to decide what their priorities are and accept living with maybe a couple of these getting through and maybe 1 or 2 getting watered down. Some of the folks involved in the House Republican caucus are not necessarily inclined to do that and have been using the Rules Committee very aggressively to get their way. This is a success for Republicans to get this bill through as they have, and I think it's good that they've put themselves on the record on some of these policies, and they will have a stronger position to get some of them because they've done that. But you could see another effort to derail the bill after a conference product emerges, and I think that would be a mistake because Congress is trying to get 12 appropriations bills through this year, and this is just the beginning of that process on defense. It's an authorization bill, then you've got to move an appropriations bill, and Congress has to do that, or there are spending cuts baked into the budget deal that Biden brokered with McCarthy. So I think it's in everybody's interest to get a final product done. And I think this is a good first step toward that. But everybody's going to have to be willing to compromise. And it's not exactly in fashion in Washington these days.